Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my watercolor painting process for this realistic green succulent. This one was developed in what I would consider to be 5 layers of paint. This doesn't mean that all throughout the painting I, laid down 5 layers of paint. It just means that in specific areas, for example, the areas that I wanted to push the darker values in, those actually have the majority of the layering, and the areas of lighter values, and of course the lightest lights, have only one very translucent layer of paint. So I'm going to be walking you through my entire step-by-step process, and I'm going to be making a point of actually letting you know when it is that I allowed everything to dry completely before coming back in to further darken or add more layers of paint, because that is super important when you're developing this kind of painting. Usually when we're going for higher levels of realism, of course it's going to take a longer time, and we're usually going to be developing more layers, and it's important to know when to allow that previous layer to dry completely before going back in. And I would say it's also super important to stem from a reference photo. So this is the photo that I chose for this piece. I really wanted to share it with you. You can see a few differences. But for the most part, what I took from this reference photo are the values, where the lightest lights are, where the midtones are, and where the darkest darks are, because value really is number one when it comes to creating a sensation of realism and three-dimensional form. And I know that by having that reference photo with such reminders, I know that there is a higher chance that I'm going to arrive at a more believable outcome, especially because this is something that I had never painted before. You can see how I've made some changes from how the succulent looks like in the actual reference photo. In this photo, you can see some dirt collected inside some of the leaves, and you can also see how some of the leaves are slightly damaged. So I took those things out, and I also brought in the little red tips, which I painted in with carmine. And this for me is how I like using reference photos. I am taking what I need, values and 3D forms and all of that, to make something look believable, but at the same time, I'm allowing myself to bring in my artistic license. I want to take a moment to just say that if at any point in time during this layering process you find you like the way your succulent looks, then by all means leave it as is. You do not have to push forward. There are so many different ways that you can paint with watercolor. Some artists paint with only one layer, and it's usually the artists who like a more expressive, looser kind of look. You can do 2 layers, you can do 3 layers, you can do more, but there are certain things that you have to keep in mind and kind of respect, such as making sure that you're giving that paper enough time to dry in between your layers if you don't want to create a mess or overwork your paper, etc. It's also super, super important that if you're planning on working in layers like what I'm doing today, that you choose a watercolor paper that is going to allow you to do that, because otherwise, for example, when I work on some papers by Strathmore or the Stonehenge paper, which is supposed to be 100% cotton, what I've found is that the paint, the underneath layers that have already completely dried, they reactivate and start moving around very easily. At least that's what happens for me. So if I'm working with just one layer or certain techniques, then those papers can be awesome. But it is very important just to take into account the different techniques and overall method it is that you're going to be using, and just make sure that you know that you're aware that the paper that you're using is going to have a great impact on your process and your end product. So for this kind of painting, usually I go for arches, and I was just pleased to see that this paper from Canon worked quite well for me. I am going to be using, for the first time ever, Canon Heritage 100% cotton 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. The 6 colors of paint that I'm going to be using are for my St. Petersburg White Nights full pan paint set, and the specific colors are Indian Yellow, Carmine, Sap Green, Cobalt Blue, Ultramarine Blue, and Burnt Umber. I used a total of 4 round brushes for this one in sizes 16, 12, 6, and 4. I taped my watercolor paper down onto my green cutting mat with regular, I think this one is 3/4 of an inch masking tape. The only thing I make sure to do is run my masking tape over my clothes like 3 to 4 times before taping my watercolor paper down in order to soften that adhesive and make it a lot less likely that I'm going to damage my paper at the end when I remove it. As always, you're going to be able to find links to all of these different items that I'm going to be using today down below in the description box of this video in case you'd like to go and check them out. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started with the very first phase of this painting process, which is laying down a first layer of very light and translucent yellow. So I created an Indian yellow plus water mixture in that large swell on my color mixing palette. You can see how that color mixture is nice and juicy. It has a good amount of water in there, but also a good amount of color. So what I am doing here is I am placing some of that color in some sections of this succulent, but then once I feel I have a good amount of color in there, I am just dipping my paintbrush in my container of clean water and going in with more water in my bristles than paint. I don't want it to be sopping wet though, but what I do with this water that I have in my paintbrush bristles is I extend that color outwards. I bring it out from there. This makes it so that I can ensure that this first layer of paint is very light and translucent. I'm bringing out just a little bit of color at a time and then extending it more and then bringing in a little bit more and then extending it and so on until I cover up this entire succulent shape. I don't want to start going in with a ton of yellow and lose that translucency because this layer is basically going to stand for the lightest values in the succulent. And if I go in with a bunch of yellow or a very saturated yellow all over the succulent, I am going to get rid of those lightest values in my succulent. And I don't want to do that because when we're going for a higher level of realism, it's important that you have a wide range of values starting from super light lights to a wide range of midtones to pushing those darkest darks. If you don't account for highlights and those lightest light values, then automatically you're going to make your range of values more limited. And this can lead to flatness. When we're painting with watercolor, it's super important to just realize that the lightness of your paper under your paint is standing in place for your lightest values and your highlights. And we're using our paper in combination with this translucent paint to develop our wide range of values and translucencies. All right, so I'm almost done with this initial layer of yellow color, and this yellow is going to provide a nice glow from underneath the layers of green that we're going to be placing next. So throughout this entire process, I've been working very loosely and relatively quickly so that by the time that I'm done here, no one section of this succulent is starting to dry because throughout this process, I've been constantly bringing out more water a little bit at a time from my container of water as I've been extending that color. And once I had created that light translucent initial layer all throughout the succulent, I allowed myself to drop in a little bit more of that yellow into little areas here and there, especially areas that I would be darkening even more later on. So areas of darker values that I would be developing. Right here, you're seeing me use my absorbent towel just to very gently lift up some of that yellow in some little sections of lighter values that I felt I added way too much color in that I wanted to lighten back up. So if at any point in time you feel you've dropped in way too much color or things are starting to look too flat, help yourself with your absorbent towel, whether it's a regular kitchen paper towel or something like what I have here. I like using the Blue Scotch Shop towels. I buy these via Amazon and I love them because I can reuse them again and again and again. But you can always lift up some of that color while that paint is still wet. Okay, so after finishing up with that initial layer of yellow, I allowed everything to dry completely. It's very important that before getting started with the next layer, your paint has completely dried. So what we're gonna be doing next with the second layer of paint is we're gonna be working on each little leaf individually. So you're gonna see me jump around the entire succulent. Why? Because I want to make sure that I am not painting in a leaf that is right next to a leaf that I have just painted. Because if I do that, I can create backruns because that paint is not completely dry. And so watercolor, remember, it's always going to expand into paper that is wet. And so if you start painting in a leaf that is right next to one that you just painted, then what's going to happen is that that color is going to start merging into that color that is still wet from that previous one. So this is why you're going to see me jump around throughout this entire phase of this process. So I'm using my size 6 round brush for this phase of this process, especially for the larger leaves that we're able to see. I'm probably going to switch to my smaller size 4 round brush for those inner leaves. You can feel free to use whichever paintbrush size feels more comfortable to you. I personally like pushing as much as I can do with the largest paintbrush possible a lot of the times, just because when I use very, very small brushes, it's very easy for me to start getting way too finicky and focus way too much on little tiny details when I know that that's not really my style. But feel free to switch to an even smaller brush than my size 4 round if you need to, especially for those smaller ones in the middle. Okay, so I am using my size 6 round brush and my plain sap green color mixture that I created with some water in one of the wells on my color mixing palette. You can see that I am going in initially with the sap green in a pretty translucent state. And if at any point in time I feel I've dropped in enough color, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in with more water in my paintbrush to further distribute that paint around in a larger area. I also constantly help myself with my absorbent towel to stay on top of water control and do any lifting while that paint is still wet that I need to do. I am making sure not to start placing a ton of sap green just willy-nilly all throughout the leaf, because that is going to lead to flatness. And you can see me constantly use my absorbent towel whenever I feel I've placed way too much color and I just want to make sure that things are not getting way too flat. I go in with my absorbent towel and lift up some of that color in areas of lighter values that I see in the reference photo to add a little bit more dimension and that variety of values that we've been talking about before that color dries. So with my way of working with watercolor, what I like doing is making my way towards darker and more saturated color incrementally, because this is going to allow me more control so that, again, I'm able to develop a wide range of values that will lead to a higher level of realism and 3D form. If you go in with super saturated sap green, or the darkest green that you can achieve with your sap green, then you're gonna probably just create a very flat looking leaf. So what I like doing is initially I went in with this color in a semi-translucent state with quite a bit of water in it, and you can make sure to test out your color mixtures on a scrap piece of watercolor paper before going into your painting to make sure that it's the right color and the right translucency that you need. Both of these are important. But once I have that initial very light layer of sap green, I then allow myself to drop in even more of this color into darker value areas that I'm going to be darkening even more with subsequent layers of paint. So I just drop in even more color in darkest dark areas while that initial very translucent green is still wet. Throughout this entire process, I am constantly looking at my reference photo and taking clues as to where lightest lights are, where midtones are, and where darkest darks are. And I know that when we're painting something like this plant, in which we have so many little overlapping forms, irregular overlapping forms, it can get kind of intimidating and we can get lost throughout that painting process. So something I would highly recommend is actually opening up your image in, if you don't have a photo editing software, then some other image viewer that you have on your device, on your computer, iPad, or whatever it is that you're using, and zoom into section by section that you're working on. And don't allow yourself to get overwhelmed or confused by other sections. So as I am working on these leaves, I am zooming into my image in Photoshop with that initial layer of translucent green in there. I allow myself to drop in a little bit of more green in areas that I want to darken more in this layer of paint. You can see though how I've left many little sections in which that yellow in that first layer is shining through completely unpainted with the second layer of paint. So some of these little sections that I have left are just organic little shapes that I've created naturally as I've been just jumping around and painting as loosely as possible, staying within each leaf shape. But other little sections, especially the ones around the edges of the leaves, I actually mindfully saved and left unpainted with the second layer of paint, because I noticed in the reference photo that the edges of the leaves have very light values. They look almost light yellow. So I am trying to stay away from painting the edges of the leaves. And this is going to be helpful because this is also going to help us separate one leaf from the next leaf. Remember to take it a step forward into darker values incrementally. Essentially, if you have that light yellow there, you don't want to go in with a super dark and saturated dark green. You want to make sure that you're thinking of bridge kind of transition colors before getting into darker midtones and darker darks. Go in initially with a semi-translucent layer of sap green, and then you can drop in a little bit more of the sap green to saturate that color even more in darker dark areas while that initial translucent layer of sap green is still wet. When you drop in more green on that layer of paint that is still wet, you're going to be left with soft transitions, a soft feathering out of that darker green turning into lighter green. But if your paint starts to dry, then you're going to be left with hard, sharp edges around that new shape that you paint in. Continue helping yourself with your absorbent towel as you're moving along. Make sure that you're lifting excess paint or water that you accidentally place on your paper. And you can also see me constantly just tap the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel before going into my painting sometimes, just to stay on top of that water control. That absorbent towel is your friend, so make sure to use it as you move along. All right, so I am going to go quiet as I continue working on this phase of the painting process. I am going to be switching to my smaller paintbrush, my size 4, as needed as I continue jumping around from leaf to leaf, creating the second layer of paint. All right, you guys, so it's time to get started with layer number 3. I'm gonna allow everything from that second layer of paint to dry completely before going in with this third layer. So we're gonna deepen and darken some sections even further. We're focusing on darkest dark areas now. And what I am doing right here is I am darkening my green and getting it a little bit more towards the cool side by adding some cobalt blue into that sap green. I highly recommend testing your color mixture out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper before actually going into your painting with it. I always have scrap pieces of watercolor paper on hand when I am painting, and these are just old paintings that I didn't like, that I've just cut up into little strips or little sections that I keep so that I can test out color mixtures and transparencies when I am working on future paintings. So in this stage of the process, I am focusing on carving out those darkest dark values, and I'm leaving all of the lighter midtones and lightest lights completely untouched and uncovered with this new layer of paint. So it's very, very important that we're constantly looking at that reference photo and noticing those darkest dark shapes, those darkest values that we want to carve out even more. You're going to notice that around some of these shapes, we have a sharp, defined edge, and others are softly transitioning into lighter value areas. And it's very simple. If you want to soften that edge, all you have to do is remove all of the color from your paintbrush bristles and go back in with a clean and only slightly damp paintbrush and run those bristles along the edge of that shape that you just painted in, and that is going to soften that edge. Try to do that though while that paint is still wet so that you don't have any troubles creating any patchiness or undesired little splotchy effects. Make sure that you're switching between your different paintbrushes as needed. If you want to use a smaller brush, just switch on to a smaller brush. And if it's a larger leaf, you can use a larger brush. I like acknowledging all of these different value shapes as abstract, irregular shapes and staying away from the look of anything too blocky, too organized or patterny, or anything that looks like lines, because that is going to flatten out areas and retract from the realism that I'm trying to create. I want to make sure that everything makes sense with what I am seeing in the reference photo. Even though I am not really stressing about getting all of these shapes exactly the same as what I am seeing in the reference photo, I am more so just acknowledging their overall size and general shape, but if they're a little bit different, that is perfectly okay. So at this point in the process, because I've already developed lightest light areas, meaning I have areas in which I have that whiteness of that paper shining through almost completely. I have also created very light values and lighter midtones. By this point in the process, I'm just pushing those darkest dark areas and I am focusing on that and leaving everything else just completely uncovered, those lighter values completely uncovered with this next layer of paint. And because we're working on very dark values at this point, I am going in with a more saturated version of my color. I am using just a very small amount of water by this point. I am not going in with my damp paintbrush and adding more water and distributing that color amongst the larger area. I am just painting in, concentrating on that dark value shape and painting that in and keeping that more in control so that I'm only darkening that little shape and not the rest of the lighter values, because that would flatten things out. So I'm going to keep working on one leaf at a time. There are certain leaves in which the entire leaf stays within those midtones and there are no darkest sections, so you don't even have to go into those with this new color. You can leave them be with the previous layers. Okay, so let me hands-on show you a little example here of what I am doing to soften those edges. So right here, I am painting in this abstract shape for my dark value there. Then once I have enough color in there, I remove all of the color from my paintbrush bristles. I remove the excess water by blotting my bristles on my absorbent towel so that I don't go in with a huge amount of water that will disturb that paint and just create splotches. And then I run my bristles of my paintbrush along that edge, and that softens that edge out. I'm gonna do that right here next as well. And you're gonna see me use this technique over and over. As you continue pushing those darkest values, you're gonna notice that certain leaves start lifting up because this darker value separates the leaves even further. As you continue working on developing a wider range of values and deepening those darkest dark areas, things really start to pop out and become more 3D. Now, you can allow yourself to play with this darker blue-green color mixture. So if you see a dark value, but it's not really one of the darkest dark areas, then you can use this color mixture in a semi-translucent state. Whereas if you see the reference photo and you really see a very, very dark value, then you can go in with this color in a more saturated state, meaning it has a less amount of water in it. When we're working with this medium, with watercolor, it's just a very fluid process, and we're constantly shifting and changing the ratio, not only in terms of water to paint ratio in our color mixtures, but also color to color ratios in our color mixtures, depending on what it is that we're doing. So in this case, for example, if we've added in this cobalt blue into the sap green to darken the green, we can always add a little bit more sap green to lighten it back up, or more cobalt blue to darken it. But we can also use this color in a more saturated state, meaning with less water, and we can also make it lighter by adding more water. So when working with this medium, you're constantly shifting these things, modifying the amount of paint to paint ratios and the amount of water to paint ratios in your color mixtures, depending on what it is that you're doing. But what's important is that you actually move along mindfully. Are you trying to develop a darker value? Then make sure that you have enough, in this case, blue in your color mixture, and you can go in with a lesser amount of water. If you're trying to develop a lighter mid-tone, then perhaps consider going in with a more translucent version of your pure sap green. So it's all about just moving ahead mindfully and really knowing what it is that you're trying to do along the way. When working with this medium, we can't really go in and cover up our mistakes with a layer of paint like we can do when working with mediums such as acrylics or oils. So it's very important, I have found, to not only go in with a strategy in terms of the techniques, the number of layers that you're going to be using, the colors that you're going to be using, etc., but also to stay mindful along the way. If you start working way too fast, you start getting anxious and try to finish too fast, you start losing patience and working on paper that is still wet, start overworking things, stuff like that. That's when we tend to make mistakes that just kind of snowball until we create a mess, or just mistakes that are super, super obvious that can't easily be made less noticeable, so to speak. I am done with carving out those darkest dark values. I'm pretty happy with how everything is looking. I allowed everything to dry completely after having worked on layer number 3, which things dried pretty quickly because by this point we're using just a little amount of water, and the less amount of water you use, usually things are going to dry much faster versus when you use a larger amount of water. Okay, so everything dried completely, and I am now working on layer number 4. This is a layer that I often have to do at the end. I do it very loosely, but the purpose of this layer is mainly to work on transitions. Wherever I feel that there is a very big gap or step between a very dark value and a lighter value that I feel in the photo shows a softer transition between the two, I work on that. If I feel I need to push darker mid-tone areas a little bit more, I also do that. Always by making sure to go in initially with the pure sap green and then drop in that darker green into that wet paint. And I just kind of bridge the gap, brighten that green in certain areas with the pure sap green, and bring the different values together. This is also a great opportunity to brighten the lightest greens without covering up the highlights, of course. You want to keep them protected, but it's also a great opportunity to lightly and loosely create a light semi-translucent wash over your lighter green mid-tone areas with your pure sap green with some water in it. And this is really going to help brighten and liven up that green right back again. Oftentimes, when you work on your darkest dark areas, when you see those relationships between your lighter values and your darker values that you've now developed, you sometimes see that there is some work in those transitions that needs to get done. And sometimes the lighter, brighter green midtones need to be livened up again, I feel. It's important to remember that watercolor tends to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. And oftentimes when we start developing those darkest darks, there's this discrepancy that naturally happens in some areas, and we have to go back in and work on those transitions. However, I think it's important in this step to not overdo it, so that you can keep things fresh. So something that I like doing is I really don't go into areas that I feel don't need any more work in them, and I'm constantly taking breaks and stepping back from my work and just seeing everything as a whole. All right, so I am almost done with this, and once I'm done, it's gonna be time to work on my area of cast shadow and occlusion shadow right under the succulent. And for this, I'm gonna create a gray for myself. And this is a dark gray that I often like creating by mixing together my ultramarine blue with a dark brown. Sometimes for my dark brown, I use burnt umber, sometimes sepia, sometimes Mars brown. So you can use your French ultramarine, your ultramarine blue, and whatever dark brown you'd like. And have patience as you create your color mixture, because you have to reach a ratio between your different colors that looks like gray. If it has more blue in it than brown, it's probably going to look like a dark blue. And if it has more brown than blue in it, it's going to look like a dark brown. So shift your ratios of your colors in your color mixture until you arrive at a dark gray, and make sure that you test it out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper before going in. So just like with everything that I've been doing so far, you probably saw just a moment ago how I initially went in with this gray in a semi-translucent state, meaning it had quite a bit of water in there. And I did that kind of pulling out technique that I was doing previously with the leaves of the succulent, in which I went in with a paintbrush with some water in it, and I just pulled that color out so that I could ensure that the areas of that cast shadow that are furthest away from the succulent were lighter than the areas of occlusion shadow closest to the subject. And then with that initial light layer of gray in there, I allowed myself to drop in even more gray in the areas of occlusion shadow closest to the subject, because those are the areas in which the subject, the mass of the subject, is blocking the light from hitting the surface beneath it. So I wanted to make sure that I had a nice variety of gray values even within the cast shadow. All right, so we are officially in the very last part of this painting process, and this is just me adding some carmine, so some red. You can use alizarin crimson or rose madder, anything like that, for the tips of the succulent. And all I am doing here, after everything has completely dried, is I am going in with my size 6 round brush. You can feel free to use a smaller brush. And I am pre-wetting the tips of the succulent leaves with clean water. Make sure to change your water before doing this step, because if you have any gray or green in your container of water, This can really mess with the brightness of this red because green and red are complementary colors, meaning they mute each other out. And of course, gray is always going to also make something look less bright. So I made sure to change my water before working on this final step. And all I am doing, as I said, is I am using my size 6 round brush to pre-wet the tips of the majority of these leaves. And then after I have pre-wetted that little shape along the leaves, especially in that little peak or point in the middle of these leaves, I drop in some carmine. And then sometimes when I don't like the shape that I've created, I just go in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush and just move that color around a tiny, tiny bit. And you can feel free to drop in even more of your red right on that peak if you want to really deepen that red in that little point there in the middle of those leaves. I wanted to pre-wet these little sections before dropping in my color so that I could get a bit of that nice wet on wet effect and soft transitions instead of getting a very tightly drawn shape with very sharp defined edges around it. And this way, if I had any bleeding happening in which that red kind of bled into that green, it would still look very nice. All right, and with that, we are done with this watercolor succulent. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really, really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much, much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you found some helpful nuggets in it, that you found it inspiring, and if you did, pretty please, I'd super appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up and share with family or friends who you think would find it helpful as well. That really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows others to get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and keep on creating. Bye guys!